He planted the evidence, falsified the report, and smiled as the handcuffs clicked shut, closing the book on another high-profile case. Detective Miller, a decorated but deeply corrupt cop, was a master at finding the perfect person to frame. Tonight, he chose a quiet, unassuming black man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what happens when a predator's perfect frame-up targets the one man in the entire city he can't afford to cross? The man didn't panic. He didn't plead. He watched Miller's every move, not with the fear of a victim, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a superior assessing a subordinate's fatal error. Who is this man, and why does his quiet confidence feel more dangerous than any threat? Because Detective Miller thought he was pinning his crime on a nobody, a convenient scapegoat the system would easily swallow. He had no idea he had just framed the city's new reform-minded police chief, working his first day undercover to identify the rot in his own department. This isn't just the story of a bad arrest. It's the story of a wolf who just tried to frame the master of the hunt. Hello, family, and welcome back. We are so grateful to have you here with us. Before we dive into tonight's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Now, get comfortable, relax, and enjoy the story.
The night air in Oakmont's West District was heavy with the smell of rain on hot asphalt and the ghosts of forgotten industry. Streetlights cast a sick, orange glow on the cracked pavement, creating islands of light in a sea of shadows. It was a part of the city the powerful had abandoned long ago, leaving it to fester. For Detective Vince Miller, it was a hunting ground. He sat in his unmarked sedan, the engine a low, predatory rumble, his eyes scanning the quiet street. Beside him, his younger partner, Calloway, nervously tapped his fingers on the dashboard. "You sure about this, Vince?" Calloway asked, his voice tight. "The captain's breathing down our necks about that missing weapon. An internal review is the last thing we need." "Relax, kid," Miller grunted, his gaze fixing on a solitary figure walking down the sidewalk. "The captain doesn't want a review. He wants a collar. High-profile case, high-profile gun. The public wants a monster. So, we give them one." The figure was a black man, mid to late 40s, dressed in a simple dark hoodie, jeans, and work boots. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't doing anything suspicious. He was just there. And in Miller's world, that was enough. "There's our guy," Miller said, a cold, satisfied smile touching his lips. He had done this 100 times. The key was to find someone who fit the profile, someone the system was already predisposed to believe was guilty. Someone who wouldn't fight back too hard. He pulled the car to the curb, its tires crunching on loose gravel. "All right, kid. Watch and learn. Body cam off until I say so." Plausible deniability. They stepped out of the car, two shadows detaching themselves from the darkness. The man, Elias Vance, saw them approach. He stopped, his posture calm, his hands slowly coming out of his pockets, open and visible. It was the careful, practiced movement of a man who understood the rules of a dangerous game. "Evening, gentlemen," Vance said, his voice even and deep. "Is there a problem?" Miller ignored the question. He shone his flashlight directly in Vance's eyes, a classic disorientation tactic. "Let's see some ID. Hands on the hood." Now, it was not a request. It was an assertion of absolute, unquestionable dominance. The profiling was raw, immediate, and without pretense. There was no traffic violation, no suspicious activity. There was only a black man in a hoodie in a neighborhood Miller had already condemned. Vance didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply turned, placed his hands flat on the cold, damp hood of Miller's sedan, and waited. Inside, however, a switch had been flipped. He was no longer a civilian. He was an operator. His mind became a clean, cold recording device, cataloging every single detail. Illegal stop. No probable cause. Failure to identify officers. Coercive commands. "What's your name?" Miller barked, running his hands down Vance's legs in a rough, invasive pat-down. "Elias Vance." "What are you doing in this neighborhood, Elias?" Miller sneered, finding nothing but a wallet and a set of keys. "I'm just walking," Vance replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Just walking," Miller mocked. He glanced at Calloway, a silent signal passing between them. Phase 2. Calloway moved to Vance's car, a modest, 10-year-old sedan parked a few feet away. "Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle, Elias?" he asked, the politeness a grotesque parody of the law. "I do mind," Vance said clearly. "You don't have a warrant, and you don't have my consent to search my property." Miller laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Hear that, Calloway? We've got ourselves a constitutional scholar." He shoved Vance hard against the car. "That's probable cause right there. Resisting. It was a lie, and they all knew it." Vance's mind recorded it. False claim of resistance to justify an illegal search. As Miller held Vance against the car, Calloway opened the driver's side door. With a movement so smooth it was almost invisible, he reached under his own jacket and pulled out a heavy, black semi-automatic pistol with a modified barrel, the missing weapon from the arms trafficking case. He let it drop under the driver's seat. Calloway backed away from the car, his face a mask of feigned surprise. "Vince," he said, his voice filled with theatrical shock. "You're going to want to see this." Miller shoved Vance toward Calloway. "You stay right there." He leaned into the car, and after a moment of performative searching, he emerged, holding the gun in a gloved hand. He held it up in the orange streetlight, admiring his own handiwork. "Well, well, well," Miller said, his voice dripping with false triumph. "Looks like our walker here is holding some serious hardware. An untraceable Mac 10 with a custom suppressor. The exact piece missing from the River Street bust." He turned to Vance, his eyes glinting with the thrill of the kill. "You're in a world of trouble, son. You're looking at 20 years easy." This was the moment the trap was sprung, the moment when an innocent man was supposed to break. He was supposed to panic, to plead, to cry, to deny. He was supposed to give Miller the emotional satisfaction of the kill. Elias Vance did none of those things. He looked at the gun in Miller's hand. He looked at Calloway's poorly concealed smirk. And then he looked at Miller, his gaze so cold, so analytical, so utterly devoid of fear, that for the first time that night, a flicker of unease went through the corrupt detective. Vance's eyes weren't the eyes of a cornered suspect. They were the eyes of an expert assessing a subordinate's sloppy, catastrophic failure. He was taking in every detail. Miller's violation of evidence protocol by holding the gun so carelessly, Calloway's failure to secure the scene, their joint failure to read him his rights before questioning. "You've made a mistake," Vance said, his voice quiet but carrying an impossible weight of authority. Miller's unease was instantly replaced by rage. "Oh, I've made a mistake," he snarled. He slammed Vance against the car, the metal groaning in protest. He twisted Vance's arm behind his back, the joint screaming in pain. "Your mistake was being born. Your mistake was being here tonight." He snapped the handcuffs on, the cold steel biting into Vance's wrists. "Elias Vance," Miller growled, a parody of the formal arrest procedure. "You have the right to remain silent." As they shoved him into the back of the sedan, the world shrinking to a cage of smeared glass and stale air, Vance didn't look defeated. He looked satisfied. He had seen everything he had come to see. The rot, the corruption, the casual, unquestioning profiling. The press of the handcuffs on his wrists wasn't a mark of his shame. It was the final piece of evidence he needed. The hunter had willingly walked into the trap, and now he had everything he needed to burn the whole forest down. The inside of the cruiser was a cage of cold vinyl and the sour smell of old fear. As the city lights of Oakmont streaked past the smeared glass, Elias Vance sat perfectly still, the steel of the handcuffs a cold, familiar weight on his wrists. Detective Miller, in the front seat, was laughing with his partner, recounting their successful collar. To them, the man in their back seat was a nobody, a ghost already being swallowed by the system. He was a lamb, destined for slaughter. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a cage with a lion. To understand the profound, catastrophic miscalculation Miller had just made, you had to understand who Elias Vance truly was. He wasn't just a man, he was a reckoning. For 20 years, he had been the man that broken cities called when their police departments had become cancerous. He was a reformer, a brilliant and ruthless architect of accountability. He was the mind behind the Atlanta Miracle, where he had taken a department drowning in corruption scandals and in 3 years transformed it into a national model of community policing, firing 24 officers and indicting 3 captains in the process. He didn't just trim the weeds, he ripped out the roots, no matter how deep they went. And Oakmont's roots were rotten to the core. The city was hemorrhaging money, paying out millions in wrongful conviction lawsuits, each one a testament to the OCPD's culture of impunity. The city's credit rating was about to be downgraded to junk status. The mayor, facing a recall election and the city's potential bankruptcy, had made a desperate, secret phone call. He had summoned Elias Vance. Vance's appointment as the new chief of the Oakmont City Police Department was the city's most closely guarded secret. He wasn't scheduled to be announced for another 48 hours. But Vance had a method, a ritual he performed before any takeover. He believed you couldn't understand a disease from a sanitized office. You had to see it in its natural habitat. So, for his first 72 hours in Oakmont, he became a ghost. He shed the tailored suits and the title of commissioner, and donned the uniform of the invisible, a hoodie, worn jeans, and the weary expression of a man just trying to get by. He walked the streets of the city's most neglected neighborhoods, listening, watching, and feeling the pulse of the community that his future department was supposed to serve, or, as he suspected, to terrorize. He wasn't just taking a walk tonight. He was conducting a diagnostic on the soul of his new city. And he had just found the cancer. On the other side of the plexiglass divider, Detective Vince Miller represented everything Vance had come to destroy. Miller was a living legend within the OCPD, a throwback to an era of policing when results were all that mattered, and the law was a flexible tool to achieve them. He had a solve rate on high-profile cases that was the envy of every detective in the city. When a politician's kid went missing or a big-shot lawyer got carjacked, the case landed on Miller's desk, and everyone knew, with a wink and a nod, that it would be closed fast. A flashback cuts to a dimly lit interrogation room 5 years prior. A young, terrified Latino kid sits at a table, his hands cuffed. Miller stands over him, his shadow a suffocating presence. "Look, Miguel," Miller says, his voice a low, paternal purr. "We know you didn't pull the trigger. But my captain needs a body for this. The media is screaming. So here's the deal. You sign this confession, you say you were the lookout, and I'll make sure the DA goes easy on you. You'll be out in 7. You fight this? You go down for life. Your choice." The kid, broken and seeing no other way out, signs. Another case closed. Another monster put away, as far as the public was concerned. Miller was a predator, but a specific kind. He never targeted the powerful. He preyed on the weak, the disconnected, the people whose voices the system was designed to ignore. He was a master of the frame-up, an artist who painted with planted evidence and coerced confessions. His protection was absolute. His union boss, a powerful cigar-chewing bulldog named Frank Rizzo, saw Miller as the embodiment of real policing. Any complaint against him, and Rizzo would unleash a hellfire of legal and political pressure that made the problem disappear. Miller's superiors, in turn, loved him because his spectacular solve rate made them look good and kept the media off their backs. He was the department's necessary evil, the celebrated fixer who kept the ugly machinery grinding along. He had built a legacy not on justice, but on the strategic, merciless sacrifice of the innocent. To him, men like Elias Vance weren't citizens, they were a resource. They were the anonymous, interchangeable faces he could pluck from the street and pin a crime on, confident that no one would question it, and no one would care. He wasn't a lion. He was a hyena, a scavenger who only attacked the weak and the isolated. As the cruiser pulled into the Sally port of the OCPD headquarters, the irony was almost poetic. Miller, the celebrated lamb in wolf's clothing, believed he was dragging a sacrificial offering into his den. He had no idea he was the one being led to the slaughter. Elias Vance, the quiet man in the back of his car, was the true predator in this story. He was the lion who had disguised himself as a lamb to learn the secrets of the hyenas. And the hunt was just beginning. Vance looked at the precinct, and a cold, determined resolve settled in his chest. He was no longer just here to observe. He was here to cleanse. Is a person's true character defined by their public reputation or by the actions they take when they think no one is watching? Share your thoughts on this in the comments below. The booking process was a masterclass in dehumanization. Elias Vance was stripped of his name and reduced to a number, processed not as a citizen, but as inventory. His fingerprints were taken, his photo captured under a harsh, unflattering light, and he was thrown into a holding cell that smelled of bleach and old despair. Through it all, he remained a silent observer, his mind a fortress of calm. He knew this part of the game. This was the system's first weapon. To strip you of your identity, to make you feel small and alone, to break your will before you even saw a courtroom. The next morning, he was shuffled in chains with a dozen other men into the organized chaos of arraignment court. The room was a meat grinder of justice, a place where overworked judges and prosecutors processed human lives with the speed of an assembly line. When his case was called, the district attorney, an ambitious, sharp-suited man named Kent Collins, stood and laid out the charges. He didn't just read them, he performed them. "Your Honor," Collins announced, his voice ringing with practiced gravity. "The state brings charges against the defendant, Elias Vance, for possession of an illegal, modified firearm with intent to distribute." The charge landed with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just illegal possession. Intent to distribute was a charge designed for arms traffickers, a high-level felony that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal prison. Miller hadn't just framed him, he had tried to bury him alive. "The evidence is overwhelming," Collins continued, glancing at the file in front of him. The weapon, a modified MAC-10 with a custom suppressor, was recovered from the defendant's vehicle during a lawful stop conducted by a decorated 25-year veteran of the OCPD, Detective Vincent Miller. Behind the prosecutor, Vance could see Miller sitting in the front row, a stoic hero in a cheap suit, his partner Calloway right beside him. They were there to show solidarity, to present a unified front. This was the blue wall of silence in action, a sacred, unspoken pact among officers to protect their own, no matter the cost. Miller's false report had already been signed and corroborated by Calloway. Their stories would be identical, an impenetrable fortress of lies. Any minor inconsistencies would be smoothed over, explained away as the chaos of a high-risk arrest. If questioned, other officers who weren't even there would swear to Miller's unimpeachable character. The system wasn't designed to find the truth. It was designed to believe the badge. The judge, looking bored and overworked, glanced at Vance. "Mr. Vance, you are entitled to legal representation. Do you have a lawyer, or will one be appointed for you?" "One will be appointed, Your Honor," Vance said, his voice calm and clear. An hour later, in a small, windowless interview room that smelled of stale coffee, Vance met his lawyer. Ben Carter was young, maybe 28, with tired eyes and a suit that was a size too big for his thin frame. His desk back at the public defender's office was a mountain of files, each one a life in crisis, a story like Vance's. He was a good man in an impossible job. "Mr. Vance," Ben began, flipping through the file, his expression already one of weary resignation. "I'm Ben Carter. I'll be representing you. I've just read the preliminary report, and I need to be honest with you. This is bad." He laid it out. "You have a decorated detective, a hero cop, swearing he found a high-powered illegal weapon in your car. His partner's report corroborates every detail. The physical evidence, the gun, is in their possession. From a legal standpoint, this is a slam dunk for the prosecution. They're going to push for the full mandatory minimum." Ben had seen this exact story play out 100 times. A black man, a decorated white cop's testimony, and a piece of seemingly undeniable physical evidence. The presumption of guilt was baked into the very fabric of the system. Juries believe cops, especially hero cops like Miller. "My best advice right now," Ben said, his voice gentle but firm, "is to consider a plea deal. Collins might be willing to drop the intent to distribute charge if you plead guilty to simple possession. You'd still do time, maybe 3 to 5 years, but it's better than 15. He expected a reaction. Anger. Despair. A frantic declaration of innocence. He got none of it. Elias Vance just sat there, listening patiently, his hands resting calmly on the metal table. When Ben was finished, Vance looked at him, his gaze analytical, intelligent, and completely devoid of panic. "I am not guilty, Mr. Carter," Vance said. "It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. I will not be taking a deal." Ben sighed. "I believe you. But what I believe doesn't matter. It's what we can prove. And right now we can prove nothing. It's your word against 2 decorated officers." "The stop was illegal," Vance stated. "There was no probable cause. They'll say you were driving erratically. They'll say you fit a description. They'll invent a reason, and because they are police officers, the court will believe them," Ben countered, the cynicism of his job showing. "The search was non-consensual," Vance continued, his voice still even. "They'll say you acted suspiciously, giving them probable cause. They'll check a box on a form, and a judge will sign off on it. This is the machine, Mr. Vance. It's designed to grind people like you up." Ben expected his client to finally break, to show some sign of the terror he should be feeling. Instead, Vance leaned forward, and his eyes, for the first time, showed a flicker of something sharp and dangerous. "Tell me, Mr. Carter," Vance asked, "are you a good lawyer?" The question caught Ben off guard. I try to be. I do the best I can with what I'm given." "Then I need you to do exactly as I say," Vance instructed, his voice taking on a new, quiet authority. "Do not waste time trying to discredit the officers. Do not file motions to suppress the evidence. They will be denied. I want you to do only two things: plead not guilty, and file a motion for the fastest possible trial date." Ben was stunned. "A speedy trial? That's insane. That gives us no time to build a defense, to investigate, to find weaknesses in their case." "Their case has no weaknesses," Vance replied calmly. "It is a perfect fabrication, a fortress of lies. You cannot attack it from the outside. The only way to win is to let them bring their fortress into a courtroom where I can dismantle it from the inside, brick by brick." For the first time, a sliver of doubt entered Ben Carter's mind. His new client didn't talk like any other defendant he'd ever had. He spoke with the cold, tactical precision of a general planning a battle. He wasn't scared. He was preparing. Ben left the meeting feeling a profound sense of unease. He had just met a man who was facing 15 years in federal prison, a man who had every reason to be terrified, but who acted like he was the one in control. The jaws of the system were closing, the evidence was stacked, the outcome seemed certain. But as he walked away, a single, nagging thought echoed in his head. What if the lamb he'd been sent to represent was not a lamb at all? How does a system that is supposed to be based on innocent until proven guilty handle a situation where it's one person's word against a decorated officer's? Share your thoughts on this complex issue in the comments. While Elias Vance sat in a county jail cell, a pawn in a game he was secretly controlling, his case file landed on the desk of Sergeant Eva Rostova. In the cynical, jaded world of the Oakmont PD's Internal Affairs Division, Rostova was an anomaly. At 32, she was young, sharp, and dangerously idealistic. She had joined IA not to climb the ladder, but because she genuinely believed in the department's motto, etched in the lobby downstairs: integrity and honor. The other detectives in the unit, older men with tired eyes, saw IA as a place to bury complaints and protect the Brotherhood. They called it the rubber stamp factory. Rostova still believed it could be a place for truth. The Vance file was supposed to be easy. Her superior, Captain Davies, a man with a politician's smile and Miller's loyalty in his pocket, had handed it to her with a casual wave. "Rostova," he'd said, not making eye contact. "Clean this one up for me." High-profile bust by Vince Miller. Big win for the department. Just cross the T's, dot the I's, and mark it cleared by end of day. The DA is fast-tracking it. It was a clear, unspoken order. Make this go away. Rubber stamp it. Don't look too closely. Rostova sat in her small, quiet cubicle and began to read. On the surface, Miller's report was a work of art, a perfect narrative of heroic police work. It detailed the anonymous tip about a suspicious vehicle, the erratic driving that justified the stop, and the aggressive, non-compliant suspect who gave them probable cause for a search. It culminated in the dramatic discovery of the weapon. Calloway's supplemental report was a perfect echo, every detail matching flawlessly. It was too perfect. Rostova's training kicked in. Her eyes narrowed. She noticed the small things that a rubber stamp was designed to miss. The timestamp on the anonymous tip in the dispatch log was 9:14 p.m. Miller's report stated he initiated the stop at 9:15 p.m. 1 minute. In a neighborhood with a labyrinth of one-way streets, it was nearly impossible for him to have received the tip, located the vehicle, observed erratic driving, and initiated a stop in 60 seconds. It was a small crack, but a crack nonetheless. Then she read Miller's description of the suspect's behavior. Subject displayed furtive movements, repeatedly looking in his rearview mirror, consistent with an attempt to evade law enforcement. It was boilerplate language, a phrase she had seen cut and pasted into a dozen other high-risk arrest reports from Miller's past. It wasn't a description, it was a template. A knot of professional unease tightened in her stomach. This felt wrong. It felt lazy. It felt fabricated. Following protocol, she went to the department's digital records to pull Miller's previous case files, wanting to cross-reference his use of that furtive movements phrase. Her access was denied. A red banner flashed on her screen. Access restricted. Requires captain-level override. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She had never been locked out of a detective's files before. She walked to Captain Davies' office. His door was open, and he was on the phone laughing. He saw her and waved her in, finishing his call. "What's up, Rostova? Tell me the Vance file is closed." "Not yet, Captain," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I was just doing my due diligence and ran into a small issue. I tried to pull Detective Miller's prior case reports for context, but my access has been restricted." Davies' smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That's a sensitive file, Sergeant. Miller's a hero cop. He works deep cover informants, high-level busts. We keep his records on a need-to-know basis to protect his methods and his sources." "I understand, sir," Rostova pressed, choosing her words carefully. "But this is an IA investigation. Technically, I do have a need to know." The captain's smile finally vanished. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, paternal tone that was more menacing than any shout. "Eva," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Vince Miller is a good cop. He takes monsters off the street. This Vance character? He's a nobody, a career criminal caught red-handed with a weapon that could take out a city block. The mayor's office wants this case closed. The DA wants a conviction. Don't be the person who complicates a simple, good thing." He was telling her to back down, but he was framing it as advice, as a way of protecting her. "Sir," she said, her own voice hardening slightly, "there are inconsistencies in the report." "There are always inconsistencies," Davies shot back, his patience gone. "It's a messy business. Cops on the street have to make split-second decisions. We in IA have the luxury of picking those decisions apart from a safe, air-conditioned office. Your job isn't to pick it apart. It's to confirm that a good cop did his job and got a dangerous weapon off our streets. Let it go. Let it go." The three most dangerous words in a police department. It was the motto of the Blue Wall of Silence. It was the phrase that buried truths and protected predators. Rostova stood her ground. "With all due respect, Captain, my job is to investigate. And right now, I have questions that are not being answered." Davies stood up, his face now a mask of cold fury. "Then let me answer them for you, Sergeant. Your question is, should I risk my entire career, my future in this department, over some nobody from the West District? And the answer is no. Close the file. That is a direct order." She stood there for a moment, the captain's threat hanging in the air between them. She had a choice. She could obey, rubber-stamp the report, and secure her future. Or she could defy a direct order, an act of career suicide, for a man she had never met, a man the system had already decided was guilty. "Understood, Captain," she said quietly, her face an unreadable mask. She turned and walked out of his office. That night, long after the precinct had emptied out, Eva Rostova sat in her dark car a block away, watching the building. She had closed the Vance file as ordered, typing the words, "Investigation complete." No evidence of misconduct found. Every letter had felt like a betrayal of her own soul. She had spent the evening wrestling with the captain's order, with the sick feeling in her gut that she was about to become a part of the very corruption she had sworn to fight. She thought of the man in the mugshot, Elias Vance. He didn't look like a monster. He looked calm, intelligent, composed. She thought of the perfect, boilerplate report. She thought of the captain's cold, threatening eyes. In that moment, she made a decision. She might have to obey the order, but she didn't have to obey the silence. She pulled out her burner phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. A former partner of hers who now worked the night shift in the cavernous, tomb-like Central Records division. "Marcus, it's Eva," she whispered. "I need a favor. A big one. And it has to stay off the books. Completely." She was no longer just a sergeant. She was a conspirator. Believing a man was being framed, she was now risking her badge, her pension, her entire career, to begin her own secret, off-the-books investigation. She was about to become Elias Vance's unwitting and only ally inside a department that was determined to bury him. While Sergeant Rostova was risking her career in the shadows of the precinct, a different kind of fire was burning in the heart of the city. In the mayor's office on the top floor of City Hall, the mood was not one of control, but of sheer, unadulterated panic. Mayor Thompson, a man who had built his career on promises of fiscal responsibility, was watching his city teeter on the edge of a financial abyss, and the name at the center of the earthquake was Detective Vincent Miller. The source of the panic was the Jackson wrongful conviction lawsuit. 5 years ago, a black man named Marcus Jackson was convicted of a murder he did not commit, based almost entirely on the ironclad testimony of the lead detective, Vince Miller. After years of appeals, new DNA evidence had exonerated Jackson. Now, his civil suit against the city of Oakmont was reaching its devastating conclusion. The jury was expected to return a verdict any day, and the city's lawyers had given the mayor a grim, confidential forecast. They were going to lose. Badly. "They're not just going to find us liable, they're going to make an example of us," the mayor hissed, pacing his office like a caged animal. His chief of staff, a perpetually nervous woman named Eleanor, held a report that trembled in her hands. The city comptroller's projection is a jury award of $50 million. Possibly more. $50 million. It was a number so large it was almost abstract, but its consequences were brutally concrete. Oakmont was not a wealthy city. A payout of that magnitude would be catastrophic, a fiscal heart attack. "It's not just the payout, sir," Eleanor said, her voice thin. "Moody's and Standard & Poor's have already put our municipal bonds on a negative credit watch. If we lose this suit, they're going to downgrade our bond rating. It could drop us to a bad one." The mayor stopped pacing and stared at her, the blood draining from his face. A bond rating downgrade wasn't just financial jargon. It was a death sentence for a city. It meant the interest rates for borrowing money for roads, for schools, for the fire department, would skyrocket. It meant immediate, brutal budget cuts. It meant laying off teachers and firefighters. It meant the city's slow decay would accelerate into a nosedive. The Jackson lawsuit wasn't just about justice for one man. It was about to bring the entire city to its knees. And the press, the mayor whispered, the thought too horrifying to say out loud. The headlines would be a bloodbath. City bankrupted by corrupt police department. The story wouldn't just be about Miller. It would be about a systemic failure that had been allowed to fester for years under his own administration. "Where is he?" the mayor demanded, his voice a low growl. "This new chief. Vance. Is he in the city yet? I need a miracle, Eleanor, and he's my last prayer." "He's on the ground, sir," she confirmed. "Began his undercover assessment yesterday, as planned. He's scheduled to be announced in 2 days. 2 days might be too late," the mayor said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We need a win. We need a different headline. We need to change the story right now." This was the pressure cooker. A desperate administration, a ticking financial time bomb, and a public relations nightmare all converging at once. They needed a hero, a victory, a story so big and so positive it could eclipse the shadow of the Jackson verdict. They needed a monster in a cage, and they needed a hero cop to put him there. The order, when it came down the chain of command, was not written. It was not recorded. It was a masterpiece of plausible deniability, a quiet, desperate whisper that traveled from the mayor's office to the chief's office, and finally, to the desk of Captain Davies. The scene shifts to Davies' office, the day of Vance's arrest. Davies is on the phone, his face a mask of stress. "Yes, Mr. Mayor, I understand the optics. We need to show the public that this department is still effective." He hangs up and immediately calls for Vince Miller. When Miller walks in, Davies doesn't waste time. "Vince," he says, his voice low and urgent, "I just got off the phone with the top floor. The Jackson verdict is coming down, and it's going to be a bloodbath. We are about to become the poster children for police corruption." Miller stands there, impassive. He's heard this before. "I need a win, Vince," Davies continues, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A big one. The River Street bust went sideways, and a high-powered, untraceable weapon is still out there. The media is having a field day with it. I need that gun off the street, and I need a body to go with it. A real scumbag. I need a headline that reads, 'Hero Cop takes down major arms trafficker.' Not city goes broke paying for Hero Cop's mistakes." The order was not explicit. Davies never said, "Go frame someone." He didn't have to. In the coded language of their corrupt ecosystem, the message was perfectly clear. "I don't care how you do it. Just get it done. And make it fast." Vince Miller wasn't just a corrupt cop acting on his own racist impulses. He was a tool, a weapon being deployed by a desperate administration to save themselves. His brazen frame-up of Elias Vance wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated move, sanctioned from the very top. He felt untouchable because, in that moment, he was the city's designated hero, sent out to find a monster. The tragedy was that in his blind arrogance and deep-seated prejudice, the first man he saw who fit his profile of a monster was the very man who had been secretly hired to hunt him. When powerful people are facing a crisis, Do you think they are more likely to seek a real solution or just find a scapegoat to take the blame? Share your thoughts on this in the comments below. The Homicide Division of the Oakmont City Police Department was a sea of smug satisfaction. The air, which usually smelled of stale coffee and desperation, was almost festive. Detective Vince Miller sat perched on the edge of a desk like a king on a throne, a cheap styrofoam cup in his hand, holding court. His cronies, a collection of old guard detectives who saw the law as a blunt instrument, laughed as he recounted a sanitized, heroic version of his arrest of Elias Vance. "So the guy starts mouthing off about his rights, blah blah blah," Miller said, taking a triumphant sip. "I told him, son, your only right is to shut up." Found a damn cannon under his seat. Another monster off the streets. The room erupted in a chorus of "Attaboy, Vince." And that's how it's done. They were celebrating more than just a closed case. They were celebrating the preservation of their world, a world where a cop's word was gospel and a nobody from the West District was an easy sacrifice. On a small television mounted in the corner of the room, the city's seal appeared, followed by the image of the mayor standing at a podium. The press conference had begun. "Ah, here we go," another detective sneered. "Time for the mayor to tell us how great we are, right before he guts our overtime." They watched with casual contempt as Mayor Thompson began to speak, his face a mask of practiced sincerity. "Today marks a new era for our city," the mayor announced. "An era of accountability, of trust, and of a renewed commitment to justice for every citizen of Oakmont." Miller rolled his eyes. Here comes the lecture. Community policing. Building bridges, same old song and dance. He and his friends chuckled. They'd seen a dozen reform efforts come and go. They had outlasted them all. They were the system, and the system was eternal. "For too long," the mayor continued, his voice taking on a new, serious tone, "this department has been plagued by a crisis of confidence. To restore that confidence, I knew we couldn't just promote from within. We needed an outsider, a reformer, someone with a proven track record of cutting out the cancer of corruption and a spine of absolute steel." The detectives in the room exchanged uneasy glances. "An outsider?" one of them grumbled. "Great. Some pencil pusher from D.C. who's never made a real collar in his life." "Doesn't matter who it is," Miller said with a confident wave of his hand. "We'll break him in. They all learn the Oakmont way eventually." On the screen, the mayor's face was grim. "I searched the country for the one person with the courage and the expertise to lead this department into the future. I found that person. He is a man who has cleaned up some of the most corrupt departments in America. A man who understands the streets because he's walked them, and who understands justice because he has dedicated his life to it. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you the new chief of the Oakmont City Police Department." The mayor gestured to the side of the stage. The camera panned. A figure began to walk toward the podium. The detectives in the precinct leaned in, a mix of curiosity and scorn on their faces. They were expecting a politician in a suit, a bureaucrat. What they saw made the air in the room freeze. The man walking to the podium was not a politician. He was a cop. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with an unshakable, commanding presence. He was wearing the immaculate, starched, and decorated dark blue uniform of the chief of police. The 4 silver stars on his collar glinted under the camera lights like chips of ice. His posture was perfect, his gaze direct and powerful. He was a black man in his late 40s, with a face that was calm, intelligent, and utterly unforgiving. He was Elias Vance. The styrofoam cup slipped from Vince Miller's fingers, its contents splashing across the grimy floor. The laughter in the room died in a collective, strangled gasp. The smug, self-satisfied smiles dissolved, replaced by masks of pale, slack-jawed, abject terror. It was him, the nobody, the monster, the career criminal from the West District. On the television, Chief Elias Vance reached the podium. He adjusted the microphone, his movements precise and controlled. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes seeming to pierce through the screen and into the very souls of the men watching in the precinct. His face was the same face from the arrest, but the context had shifted so violently, so catastrophically, that he was a different being entirely. The hoodie was gone, replaced by a uniform that radiated absolute authority. The nobody was now their commander. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor," Chief Vance began, his voice the same deep, even tone Miller remembered from the arrest, but now it was amplified, carrying the full, crushing weight of his new position. "I am honored to be here today. and I want to be perfectly clear about my mission." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "My first and only priority is to restore the integrity of the Oakmont City Police Department. And that begins with a simple, non-negotiable principle. The badge is not a shield for the corrupt. It is a symbol of public trust. And for those who have betrayed that trust, the reckoning is here." The camera cut back to the precinct. No one was moving. No one was breathing. They were a tableau of the damned, frozen in the moment of their own judgment. Calloway looked like he was about to vomit. The other detectives stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief and pure animal fear. But the camera found Vince Miller. His face had drained of all color. The world had tilted on its axis and thrown him into a freefall. The man he had framed, the man whose life he had been prepared to destroy for a convenient headline, the man he had called son and slammed against a car, was now his boss. He hadn't just framed a citizen. He had framed the one man in the entire city who now held his career, his freedom, and his entire life in the palm of his hand. The wolf hadn't just framed a lamb. He had just tried to frame the master of the hunt, and the hunt was now on for him. Have you ever witnessed a moment of public speaking that completely changed the power dynamic in a room? What made it so powerful? Share your story in the comments. The press conference ended, but the shockwave was just beginning to hit. At the Oakmont City Police Department, the detectives in the Homicide Division were frozen in a state of collective cardiac arrest, their faces a gallery of pale, ghostly horror. Detective Vince Miller stood paralyzed, the world aglow, buzzing hum in his ears. The man on the television, their new commander, was the ghost from the West District. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a public execution, and they were all on the chopping block. Before anyone could process the cataclysm, a new sound cut through their stunned silence. It started as a distant wail, growing closer with terrifying speed. The unmistakable sound of sirens, not one, but a dozen, all converging on their location. They scrambled to the windows. A motorcade of black sedans and police cruisers, lights flashing, screamed to a halt in front of the precinct, blockading the street. Doors opened, and a new command staff, unfamiliar, stone-faced officers brought in by Vance, emerged, forming a phalanx. The last car door opened, and Chief Elias Vance stepped out. He was no longer a two-dimensional image on a screen. He was a three-dimensional force of nature, his new uniform a suit of dark blue armor. The front doors of the precinct burst open, and Vance strode in. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He moved with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying calm of a tidal wave. His new command staff followed, their presence a clear signal that the old guard was now irrelevant. The lobby, usually a place of loud jokes and casual authority, fell into a tomb-like silence. Every cop, from the desk sergeant to the detectives peering from their division, stood frozen, their eyes wide. Vance's gaze swept across the room, cold and analytical. He wasn't looking at them as colleagues, he was looking at them as evidence. His eyes finally landed on the Homicide Division, and he began to walk, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum with the steady, rhythmic beat of a funeral drum. He walked through the maze of desks, each step a hammer blow to the fragile composure of the detectives. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Vince Miller's desk. Miller, who had been a lion in this room his entire career, now looked like a cornered animal, too terrified to even breathe. He was still standing, a pathetic statue of his own ruin. Vance did not raise his voice. He reached into his immaculate uniform jacket and produced a single folded document. He placed it on the center of Miller's cluttered desk with a quiet, definitive finality. "Detective Miller," Chief Vance said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You are hereby placed on immediate, unpaid administrative leave pending a full internal affairs investigation into your conduct." Miller just stared at the paper, his mind unable to form a response. "You will surrender your badge and your service weapon to my security detail now," Vance continued, his voice like a sliver of ice. "You will be escorted from this building. You are not to contact any member of this department. You are not to access any departmental files. Am I understood?" Miller's mouth opened and closed, a dry, rasping sound coming out. He gave a spastic, jerky nod. Vance then turned slightly, his gaze falling on Miller's young partner, Calloway, who was trying to make himself invisible at the adjacent desk. "You too, Calloway. Administrative leave. Surrender your weapon." Then came the final, devastating stroke. Vance turned to a woman who had entered with his command staff, a woman who had stood silently by his side, her face a mask of cold professionalism. Commander Rostova, Vance said, his voice clear and ringing. As the new head of the Internal Affairs Task Force, you will lead the investigation into Detective Miller and his associates. You have my full authority. Spare no expense. Leave no stone unturned. A shockwave went through the old guard. Eva Rostova, the idealistic sergeant who Davies had tried to shut down. Her promotion to commander, bypassing a dozen senior officers, wasn't just a promotion. It was a declaration of war. It was a signal that the era of the rubber stamp factory was over. The one person they knew couldn't be bought or intimidated was now in charge of their fates. Vance then turned to address the entire, terrified room. This division, he announced, his voice echoing in the silence, is now an active crime scene. No one will touch a phone, a keyboard, or a file. My forensics team is on its way to seize every computer, every case file, and every piece of evidence associated with Detective Miller's cases for the last 10 years. The blue wall of silence, a structure that had seemed as solid and eternal as granite, began to crack. Self-preservation, the most powerful instinct of all, began to take over. The Brotherhood was dead. It was every man for himself. As Vance's security detail began to escort a pale, trembling Miller from the room, Calloway made his move. He saw his entire future, his career, his pension, his freedom, evaporating before his eyes. He was young. He wasn't a true believer like Miller. He was just a follower who had been too scared to say no. His eyes darted from the defeated Miller to the powerful, unyielding face of Chief Vance. He made a split-second calculation. He chose survival. "Chief Vance, sir," Calloway blurted out, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic urgency. "Wait, please." Vance paused, turning to look at the young detective with his cold, analytical eyes. "Miller," Calloway stammered, the words spilling out in a torrent of betrayal. "He made me do it. He told me to sign the report. He said that's how things were done. I have a family, sir. A mortgage. I was scared to refuse. The snitching had begun. The first rat was off the sinking ship." Vince Miller, halfway to the door, stopped. He turned, his face a mask of raw, wounded betrayal. The look he gave Calloway was not one of anger, but of a man watching his own son stab him in the back. Vance's expression didn't change. He simply looked at Calloway. "Is that so, detective?" "Yes, sir," Calloway said, now weeping openly. "The gun, it was in his personal locker. From the River Street bust. He told me to lose it in the car. I can show you. I can tell you everything. About this case. About the others. The Jackson file. I know about the Jackson file." The other detectives in the room looked on, their faces a mixture of disgust and cold, hard calculation. Calloway had broken the code, but he had also shown them the only path to survival. As Vance's team began to seal off the room with crime scene tape, another detective, a man who had laughed at Miller's story an hour ago, quietly caught the eye of Commander Rostova. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The race to confess, to trade loyalty for leniency, had begun. The blue wall was not just cracking, it was collapsing into a pile of rubble. Is it more dishonorable to commit a corrupt act, or to betray a corrupt partner to save yourself? The purge was not a slow burn, it was a wildfire. Armed with Chief Vance's absolute authority and the desperate, self-serving testimony of a dozen terrified detectives, Commander Eva Rostova's new Internal Affairs Task Force moved with the speed and precision of a special operations unit. They weren't just investigating a single bad arrest. They were dismantling a criminal enterprise that had been masquerading as a police department for decades. The blue wall of silence had crumbled, and in its place was a frantic stampede of officers trying to trade secrets for salvation. Rostova's first target was the cornerstone of Miller's frame-up, the anonymous tip. Her team, a hand-picked group of young, uncorrupted analysts, bypassed the official dispatch logs. They went straight to the source, pulling the raw server data and cellular tower records for the exact second the tip was called in. It took them less than an hour to find it. The call wasn't from a concerned citizen. It was from a burner phone registered to a low-level informant on Miller's payroll named Jimmy, the Weasel Gallo. 2 hours later, Rostova and two of her investigators sat opposite Jimmy in a cold, sterile interview room. He was a small man with shifty eyes and the perpetually nervous energy of someone who had spent his life looking over his shoulder. He tried to bluster, to play the tough guy. "I don't know nothing about no tip," he sneered. "I'm a model citizen." Rostova didn't argue. She simply slid a file across the table. It contained satellite photos of his car parked 2 blocks from the scene of Vance's arrest, time-stamped 3 minutes before the tip was called in. It also contained a federal racketeering indictment, his name printed in bold letters at the top. "Here's the situation, Jimmy," Rostova said, her voice calm and cold. "You have 2 options. Option 1, you stay loyal to Vince Miller. In that case, you'll be charged as a co-conspirator in the framing of a federal officer, in addition to these racketeering charges. You'll die in prison. Option 2, you tell us everything you know about Miller's operations, and this RICO charge gets replaced with a very generous cooperation agreement. You choose." Jimmy, the Weasel Gallo, didn't earn his nickname by being loyal. He looked at the indictment, he looked at Rostova's unblinking eyes, and he folded completely. The confession was a torrent. For years, he had been Miller's go-to for planting evidence, for making anonymous tips, for providing false testimony. He gave them names, dates, and cases, a roadmap to 2 decades of Vince Miller's corruption. With Gallo's confession as a battering ram, Rostova's team turned their attention to the man who had protected Miller for years, Captain Davies. Davies had barricaded himself in his office, believing his rank and his political connections made him untouchable. He was wrong. Rostova didn't send a sergeant to get him. She went herself, flanked by 2 of Vance's new command staff. She walked into his office without knocking and placed a single sheet of paper on his desk, a signed arrest warrant. "Captain Davies," she said, her voice devoid of any of her former deference, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice and aiding and abetting the falsification of official reports." Davies's face, usually a mask of smug control, turned the color of old paper. "This is insane," he blustered, trying to regain his footing. "You can't arrest me. I'm a captain. I'll have your badge for this." "You don't have that authority anymore, sir," Rostova replied, her voice like ice. "But you do have a choice. The same one I gave Jimmy Gallo. You can go down with Miller, or you can start talking." This was the final betrayal, the kingmaker turning on his king. Davies was a political animal, and he knew a sinking ship when he saw one. He had spent his entire career protecting Miller, not out of loyalty, but because Miller was a useful tool. Now, that tool had become a liability, and Davies's only instinct was self-preservation. His confession, once it began, was a deluge. In a desperate bid for a deal, he gave them everything. He confessed to suppressing Rostova's initial investigation. He detailed the cover-up of the Jackson wrongful conviction case. He implicated a whole network of old guard detectives, a secret brotherhood within the department that had operated with impunity for years, trading favors, burying evidence, and protecting each other from any and all consequences. He gave Rostova the keys to the entire corrupt kingdom. The final scene was not a dramatic shootout or a high-speed chase. It was quiet, pathetic, and brutal. Vince Miller was at home, packing a bag, a desperate plan to flee forming in his mind. But when his doorbell rang, it wasn't a friend coming to warn him. It was Commander Eva Rostova and her task force. He opened the door and saw her standing there, her face calm, her eyes holding the cold, hard light of justice. She wasn't flanked by his old cronies or his union reps. She was flanked by a new breed of OCPD officer, young, diverse, and utterly uncorrupted. "Vincent Miller," Rostova said, her voice clear and steady, "you are under arrest for aggravated kidnapping, obstruction of justice, perjury, and a conspiracy to violate civil rights." Miller looked past her, at the faces of the officers who had come to take him away. They were strangers. His friends, the men he had protected, the men who had protected him, were all gone. They were either in other interrogation rooms, singing like canaries to save themselves, or they were at home, pretending they had never heard his name. The blue wall he had built his entire life around had not just cracked. It had been revealed to be nothing more than a phantom. As Rostova's team cuffed him, Miller didn't rage. He just looked at her, a single, dawning realization in his eyes. He had been so focused on the man he had framed that he had never seen the real threat. The quiet, idealistic woman he and his captain had dismissed as a nobody, a rubber stamp. He was arrested not by his friends, but by the very system of integrity he had spent his entire career mocking. And as they led him from his house, a broken king being dragged from his castle, he finally understood. The house of cards hadn't just collapsed. It had been methodically, systematically, and completely annihilated. 6 months after the fall of Vince Miller's corrupt kingdom, the Oakmont City Police Department was a different institution. The air of cynical, untouchable arrogance had been replaced by a tense, but palpable, sense of accountability. The wheels of justice, once clogged with corruption, had turned with a swift and terrible certainty. Detective Vince Miller, stripped of his badge and his bravado, was convicted on all counts. The testimony from his former partner Calloway, his informant Jimmy Gallo, and his own captain had sealed his fate. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison, a silent, broken man swallowed by the very system he had so expertly manipulated. Captain Davies, for his role in the conspiracy and obstruction, received 8. In total, 14 members of the Old Guard were either convicted or had resigned in disgrace, a purge that sent a seismic shockwave through the city. In their place, a new code was being written, not in the backrooms of the precinct, but in the open, under the unblinking eye of its new architect. Chief Elias Vance, with the newly promoted Commander Eva Rostova as his fiercely loyal second, had begun a radical overhaul of the OCPD. The rubber stamp factory of internal affairs was gone, replaced by Rostova's independent and feared task force. A new, civilian-led oversight board was established, armed with subpoena power and the authority to recommend termination. The old, boilerplate language used to justify illegal stops was now grounds for immediate suspension. The change was not just procedural, it was cultural. The final scene of this chapter of Oakmont's history did not take place in a courtroom or a press conference. It took place on a cool evening, on the same rain-slicked streets of the West District where the story began. Elias Vance walked the beat alone. He was not in his formal four-star uniform, but a simple OCPD-issued polo shirt and slacks. He was not here as a chief making a photo op. He was here as a man, walking the same ground where he had been deemed a monster simply for existing. The neighborhood was still rough, the scars of neglect still visible on the cracked sidewalks and boarded-up storefronts. But something was different. The fear that had once been a constant, low-grade hum in the air was now softer, replaced by a cautious, watchful curiosity. He stopped at a corner store, the same one he had been walking past the night of his arrest. He bought a bottle of water, nodding to the owner, a man who looked at him not with the suspicion reserved for a cop, but with a simple, respectful acknowledgement. As Vance stepped back outside, a group of teenagers hanging out on the corner fell silent, their eyes tracking him. It was the old, familiar dance of wariness. Vance didn't stare them down. He didn't approach with authority. He simply met their gaze and gave a small, respectful nod. He was not a threat. He was a presence. Then, a small basketball came bouncing off the curb, rolling to a stop at his feet. A young boy, no older than 10, came chasing after it, stopping short when he saw Vance. The boy froze, his eyes wide, fixed not on Vance's face, but on the shiny, silver badge clipped to his belt. It was a moment suspended in time, the old world, and the new holding their breath. The boy's parents had likely taught him to fear that badge, to see it as a symbol of danger. Vance didn't speak. He simply bent down, picked up the basketball, and held it out. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that held no agenda. "Nice ball," he said, his voice quiet. "You got a good handle?" The boy stared for a second longer, his mind processing this unexpected interaction. Then a slow, hesitant smile broke across his face. He took the ball. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm pretty good." "I can see that," Vance replied. "You keep practicing." The boy nodded, clutching the ball, and ran back to his friends, the moment of fear broken, replaced by a simple, human connection. Vance watched him go. The work was not finished. It would never be finished. Trust, once shattered, could not be rebuilt in 6 months. It had to be earned, day by day, interaction by interaction, one basketball at a time. But as he stood on that corner, no longer a target but a guardian, he knew the foundation had been laid. A new code was being written, not in law books, but in the hopeful eyes of a child who looked at a police officer and saw not a monster, but just a man. The long, hard work of weaving a new future had finally, truly begun. This story is a testament to the idea that one person's courage can be the spark that ignites systemic change. It reminds us that integrity is not just a word, but a powerful force for good in the world. If you believe in the power of truth and were moved by this story of justice, please help us share it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and accountability. Thank you for being a part of our community.